Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the September 18th workshop. We'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. Note for the record that members of council are present and accounted for except for Councilman Binder and Councilman Hypes. And as always, we begin with a Pledge of Allegiance. So if you're able, please stand and join us. So our first work session item will be the text amendments to the short-term rental. Ms. Eswine, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the text amendments that are in your packet and that I'm planning on discussing, it's two aspects of it. So there is a land use component that is wrapped up in the UDC, and then there is a regulatory framework ordinance for basically issuing licenses to operate a short-term rental. So fine, if y'all have questions, interrupt me. However it is that y'all think best, if you want to go ahead and vet out the full land use aspect, and then I can move into the ordinance, or I can just blow right through it. So if you want to interrupt me before I get into the licensing, I'm going to do land use first. Yes?
Do we have a short-term rental ordinance now?
No.
So where did this new ordinance come up from?
So
Because I was unaware of it until I looked at this packet.
absolutely. So pretty early on, when we were brought on as city attorneys, that was one of the first things that was talked about, and eventually it
By
just
who?
By Kathy Cook, Bob Regas, and
If I could,
some of
just
the mayor
because
and council.
it's something that we've had concerns from neighborhoods in Alpharetta for some time now, and that even precedes Ms. Eswine. And she's right, it was brought forward and discussed by Bob Regas and Kathy. But that was because we get complaints from time to time, because sometimes in these homeowners association neighborhoods, they can cause issues by the short-term rentals, and certain neighborhoods have repeatedly asked for us to manage it in some way, and that's why it came forward.
So I guess my question is, and only because I'm not part of the history of this, is it seems like this has come up, particularly from my point of view, out of the blue. Sorry. It's come up out of the blue. And reading through it, and this again is just my opinion on the surface at the moment, seems a bit egregious for the requirements that we're making people go through to do this. So that's why I was questioning whether this was a city council-driven thing or if it was a staff-driven thing. Why we have not had the ability to talk through it before we have an ordinance being
Based on the concerns that were raised by residents, this is something that I had asked them to look into. So you can call it driven by me, or I was the one that brought it forward, but it's from public concerns that have been raised over the last specifically 3 or 4 years.
So again, I'm just asking the questions. The ordinance was drafted by the attorneys, I assume, obviously. Under
Right.
what guidance? Where did we come up with the guidance around the ordinances being drafted?
I can answer that. So that this ordinance can be kind of pulled back a little bit to the extent you want, however much. I had given staff some drafts of other jurisdictions' ordinances. This one, I think, is actually modeled after Forsyth County's, and it does have a fair number of regulations. I'm very mindful of that. I drafted it myself. But that's where it came from. So we'd given a few options and discussed which one. And in fact, both the UDC and the ordinance itself are modeled after the Forsyth County version. But Cherokee County has adopted a regulatory ordinance. I think Dawson County has as well. Barrow County adopted a UDC amendment similar to this one, but in fact, I think it's actually a little bit broader. They just allow short-term rentals with a cup in any zoning district, but they don't actually have the permitting component, that licensing ordinance, to go hand in hand with it. So you see across the state various different ways that this has been tackled, and this was just really kind of what we landed on as a starting point, but depending on council's direction, I can pull it back or expand it however it is that y'all would like to give direction.
So can I ask the question from the ordinance standpoint? We're going to read this ordinance today. What happens, what's the process? How
So-
fast does this roll out?
It can be as fast as you want, though I would urge you, so we have to go through the Planning Commission with UDC amendments. And so I would say that the permitting ordinance should be delayed so that it goes on the agenda at the same time as the UDC amendment. So if, say, you gave direction today to move this forward to the Planning Commission, you would have to have it advertised and go before the Planning Commission. I would delay putting the ordinance on before council until the UDC amendment got to council so that they could be heard at the same time. But beyond that, if you don't want it to move forward, if you want to make changes to it, you can direct me to make whatever changes, bring it back for further discussion at another work session with you before we advertise it, either one. That's entirely up to the council as to how y'all want to manage it. I've seen jurisdictions where with a similar framework as what I've given, they've pushed it on to public hearing and then they actually make amendments once it gets to public hearing after they've thought about it and heard more from the public. And I've had others that have had it go through many workshops before they actually end up advertising it. So that is entirely in your hands.
Okay, I guess I'm going to find out what everybody else thinks, so that's all I
No,
have for the moment.
that's a good question. But that's why we're having the work session, is because this is something that's been kicked around for several years. Molly finally had a chance to really sit down and come up with something that, based on Kathy Cook and community development, thought might be workable. And this is probably the first time most of us have seen any of the details. Councilman DeRito?
Thank you, Mayor. Just a couple of questions, again, like Councilman Wells asking. What concerns were raised to trigger us to take a look at this? Just-
I think-
If I could, only because
Absolutely.
I've been involved in more of those discussions. Every quarter, I have a meeting with representatives from the homeowners associations. And I won't use the names of the specific neighborhoods, but there's a very large neighborhood on the east side of town that has repeatedly had issues with it, because sometimes it can drive a lot of additional traffic and transient
So you
residents
mean-
in there for.
Issues, Mayor, of abuse? Is that a good term? I don't know if that's a good
I
term.
would say disruption in what would typically be a single-family home neighborhood. And it's owner-occupied, it's zoned for
So
owner-occupied.
are we trying to put regulations around, is that what we're trying to do, so we don't make it become a problem citywide?
To be able to manage that,
Okay,
yes.
good.
In addition to the neighborhood that I was talking about before, there's also some neighborhoods on this side of town that are more of a condominium development, where so many of the units are being used in such a fashion that it's changing the character of the neighborhood and the association.
So along those lines, everybody's familiar with Airbnb, right? How does that stop? Will this stop, say, Airbnb or any other related entity in the future who rents properties around the world to come in and identify properties in Alpharetta, and then basically they become short-term rentals, but long-term, if you know what I mean? They become a rental property, for short-term.
So.
You know what I'm saying? So would this, is there an ability in this ordinance to not let that happen or bar those types of rentals in the city? Because that would be a real problem if Airbnb latched on to this and met all the requirements, but then started doing this in different subdivisions around the city.
So that's what the UDC amendment is aimed at. The UDC amendment, and in fact, I think this is probably a good segue to jump right in. So this is what I just said. So the UDC is to authorize short-term rentals upon applying for and receiving a CUP. So going forward now, and I won't get into grandfathered uses right now, but going forward, if someone had a residential property, decided they wanted to use it for short-term rental under this draft of the UDC amendment, they would have to come in, and if they aren't already zoned agricultural, they would have to seek rezoning, and on top of that, they would have to seek a conditional use permit specifically for the use of short-term rental. If they don't have both the zoning and the conditional use permit, they would be ineligible to short-term rent their property moving forward.
Okay, and then one more question. We have in the city, typically with new subdivisions or developments, whether it be condo or single family or mixed, there's usually, within the covenants, is a 10% cap of rentals in those communities. How does that impact that covenants that's pretty general in the state, I think? Where, like in my subdivision, we only allow up to 10% rentals. So if someone rents their townhouse or single-family home in my subdivision, either they're on a list because we've met our 10% cap, or we have a management company that does that, or we have, if they're able to rent it and they're below that 10%, how does it stop them from using it as a short-term rental consistently?
So
Is there a conflict, I guess, is my question.
I'll start by saying that nothing that the city's code is ever going to do is going to override something that's in the covenants. So if the covenants say you can't do something, and our ordinance allows for it, the covenants are going to control. As for short-term rental and how that's affected by covenants and the 10% cap that you're referencing, I'd have to look at a specific HOA or POA's covenants to know whether that is captured by their covenants or not. If you're concerned about that, we can absolutely reference in the ordinance or the UDC the fact that nothing in this is intended to or effectually supersedes any covenants that have been duly established by an HOA. We can certainly put that in there, but I would say that that's the status of the law regardless, is that if we have an ordinance that, say, allows for backyard chickens, but a set of covenants say no backyard chickens within these residential districts, then the covenants are going to control. It doesn't matter that our UDC says you can or can't do something if can do something if the covenants say you can't.
Thank you, Molly.
Councilman Will.
To follow up on that, it seems like you took it one way but not the other. So if the subdivision says we can have 10% rentals, but it's not zoned agriculture and they haven't applied for this and done that, are we saying that they're no longer allowed to have those 10% rentals?
Well, that's for short-term rental. So rental for a residential, long-term, I want to lease my house for a year is not the same thing. Short-term rental is defined within our code. So that's what I was saying. I would have to look at the specific provisions, but that's a good point. Let's take it out of the short-term rental context. If covenants say you can do something across the board, but our code says that you have to have XYZ zoning and a CUP, then it doesn't matter that the HOA says you can do it, because then it would be a violation, assuming they don't have the requisite zoning permissions from the city. They wouldn't be allowed to do it from the city.
So in theory, you got to go subdivision by subdivision and see what their covenants say.
Right, and that's not something that we need to get into the dealings of. That's self-governance by HOAs. This is intended to be a citywide regulation. And if a POA or an HOA wants to limit short-term rentals or rentals generally,
I guess where I'm going with that is if they do not specify short-term versus long-term in their 10%, then that would tell me that those 10% of people could do short-term or long-term.
Potentially.
But now as a city, we're taking that away.
Potentially. I don't know that we're taking that away, no.
If they don't qualify with everything that we ask them to qualify for.
Only for short-term rental, not for
Well,
anything
I understand,
else.
but
Yes,
if you're in the
absolutely.
10%.
Yes, this is intended to limit more what short-term rental is currently provided for in the UDC. So in the UDC right now, there's nothing explicitly saying you can't short-term rent your home, no. And so you would be correct on that. And that's a policy question for the council to consider.
Any other questions?
Right. Oh, definitely not, no. So if y'all are ready, I can go through and explain a little bit, and then you can give whatever feedback. We can put it on for another work session, however it is you want to do it. So I previously mentioned the two-pronged approach that we've got here. So this is how the UDC revisions are framed. We're adding a definition for short-term rental to go into the glossary of terms so that everybody knows what we're talking about. We identify short-term rental in the UDC as a conditional use within the AG zoning district only, which means that it's a prohibited use in any other zoning district within the city. Now, we can expand that as much as you want. I think I mentioned previously, I think that some jurisdictions in the state allow for short-term rental in any zoning district as a matter of right for residential uses. Some say you can have a short-term rental in any zoning district provided that you have a CUP. In Alpharetta, the way that I drafted it is that you have to have an AG zoning district with a cup, but you can do pretty much any combination of those that I just mentioned. So if you wanted it to be in all of the residential districts with a cup, we could do that. This is just what this draft is right now, if that makes sense. And then I've added another section to the UDC. It's currently listed as reserved, and it's section 2.7.7, which actually comes right before the bed and breakfast section, because they're kind of naturally related. And this provides for an effective date and for additional criteria for the consideration of the council to provide for a short-term rental cup. So this is the definition. It's an accommodation for transient guests. That's what takes it away from the build-to-rent type scenario. So transient guests rented for the purpose of overnight lodging for a period of less than 30 days. Now that period of less than 30 days is, again, kind of indicating that transient lodging. We're not talking about people who are extended stay. We're not talking about anyone who's intentionally or renting for their home to occupy it on a more permanent basis. And then the rest of it is basically distinguishing short-term rental from certain other uses within the UDC, specifically bed and breakfast establishments and boarding houses, and also making sure that it's clear that if you operate as a short-term rental, as I have it drafted, and we could change this, that it doesn't constitute a home occupation under the UDC, so that they're not regulated kind of in an overlapping manner. So we're saying you're not, if you're a short-term rental, you're not a bed and breakfast, you're not a boarding house, you've got your own set of regulations, and you're also not a home occupation. That's all that that last part of the definition is intended to accomplish. So in addition, this is the new section 2.7.7, and it basically provides that in addition to the conditional use review criteria that you always consider when you're granting a cup, that these are some additional factors that you would be considering in granting a short-term rental conditional use permit. And so that goes towards overnight occupancy, how many people are going to be spending the night on a property, daytime occupancy, the number of bedrooms, which kind of gives you more of an objective standard. You know, if you have a certain number of bedrooms, you're going to get a better feel for the overnight or the daytime occupancy, despite what an applicant might say, so it's kind of a checks and balance there. The capacity of a parking lot on the property, how much parking space do we have? That way, you know, basically, when you grant a cup, just like with the zoning, you can impose conditions. And so if you saw, you know, that you wanted to specifically limit the number of people staying on the property, you wanted to limit the number of cars on the property specifically because you know the parking capacity or the neighboring properties and how that might be impacted. These are the kinds of things that you would be able to consider for a short-term rental cup. The lot size specifically, the distance of the short-term rental from neighboring property lines, as well as sewer capacity and on-site septic system for the property. So all of those things would be additional criteria in addition to what you normally would consider for just any normal conditional use permit. And so that would be proposed to be within this UDC revision. And then from a housekeeping standpoint, in addition to adding the definition, we're incorporating it into the use table to make clear that short-term rental is allowed with a conditional use permit in the ag zoning district, and it's otherwise prohibited in any other zoning district. This was a map that planning was able to provide. This shows the parcels within the city that are currently zoned agricultural. And then that table down on the bottom right-hand corner is actually how they are taxed. So you can kind of see what those properties are currently being used for, and you'd see that from that tax standpoint, you've got several that are actually being used residentially. So it's 256 total parcels that have that residential classification. And move on whenever you want me to. Okay. All right, so the reason for the two-pronged approach of having a UDC amendment as well as an ordinance is basically so that you can regulate, one, the operation, the manner of operation. So we've got the land use component covered by the UDC, but the manner of operation, how many, you know, apart from you conditioning certain things, a licensing ordinance allows you to have operating procedures, an annual application, and oversight. So one thing that I've seen in other jurisdictions, even after they've adopted a land use component, is concern over whether someone is going to be a good or a bad actor. And with conditional use permits, just like with zoning, it runs with the land. And so you could have an individual who came before you and asked for a conditional use permit to operate as a short-term rental, and it might have overwhelming community support. Everybody likes it, everybody thinks it's a good business model, and that the owners are going to be responsible operators of that short-term rental. Nobody has any concerns. The issue is what happens when the property is sold. And so I would see applicants coming forward seeking a conditional use permit, and then the board or planning commission or whoever it was before would still have concerns about granting that cup, because they would be concerned that what happens if that individual sold the house and then the new owner wanted to operate as a short-term rental. What if they routinely rented to, large groups that were particularly noisy or that would have lots of traffic, and we don't have particular conditions addressing that on the conditional use permit. The way that this license would work, it subjects, in addition to having the annual application and various operating requirements, provides for the revocation of that license. Similar to how you can revoke an alcohol license if you have someone repeatedly selling underage or not, correctly paying their excise taxes or things like that. When you have repeated violations, having a license allows for additional oversight and basically checks and balances, so that you can suspend or revoke a license if you have someone who's repeatedly not operating in a manner consistent with how the city would like them to be operating. And then in addition to that, just general violations and penalties. So I'll run through those unless you have any preliminary questions.
So is there a limitation on a subdivision's ability to limit short-term rentals?
Through their covenants, they could do it that way.
So just for argument's sake, this subdivision we're speaking of, who's complaining about it, could actually limit it with their own covenants.
Pursuant to how their covenants operate. If it's not currently addressed, then amending their covenants is generally a pretty onerous task, but theoretically.
But if enough people in the subdivision wanted it, they could do it.
Theoretically, yes.
So we're creating something that the subdivision could create on their own.
It would, for subdivisions, however, that's true, but outside of subdivisions, when you have, just houses that are near each other, there wouldn't be covenants necessarily, and so those would just be based on individual property owners, and so one individual property owner could choose to rent.
That's a fair statement, but the argument has been made that it's subdivisions that are making the complaint. They could actually correct them themselves if they wanted to, and we wouldn't have to, as a city, take on this burden of oversight and licensing and all this stuff. They could do it. Okay, thank you.
On your previous slide, you gave the instance where it's just the ag properties.
Mm-hmm.
But if you'll take Windward as a whole and all the surrounding areas around that, you're saying this ordinance will just apply to the ag?
It would only apply to ag. Well, not the ordinance. The UDC revision would apply going forward only. You would have to consider with the grandfathering issue, and that would mean that if someone has been operating as a short-term rental up until this point, we would need to determine how we would want to move forward with that. And there's a few different ways we could address that. Under the law, you are entitled to a grandfathered use to continue with that non-conforming use in the immediate future. The Supreme Court has basically stated that you can do kind of a phasing out of non-conforming uses. That's not been tested. It's not been litigated. The idea there is that when you have a grandfathered use, you're not being deprived of that use of your property in an immediate sense. We adopt this ordinance, therefore now I'm not allowed to have my outdoor storage or my, auto repair establishment in this overlay that now prohibits it. And generally speaking, what we see with non-conforming uses is that they are limited to whatever use was lawful at the time before the ordinance was adopted. It can't be expanded, but we generally allow for it on an ongoing basis, despite the public policy reasons for having adopted the regulatory framework that keeps it from being used moving forward. What the Supreme Court has mentioned has been that you could theoretically phase something like that out over a reasonable period of time. And when I say it hasn't been litigated, I think I mean that. I don't know of any instance when that has been the case. you could consider doing that. Otherwise, though, the regulatory ordinance would apply to any properties in the city that have been or would be operating under both the old version of the UDC that didn't prohibit it or any new properties that come in and get the cup.
Okay. So basically, since it is so onerous for a neighborhood such as Windward or another large community or multifaceted community such as Windward, it's only going to apply for a certain area of that.
Well, the regulatory ordinance, the licensing ordinance that we haven't really dived into yet, anybody who's currently operating as a short-term rental who wanted to claim that they were lawfully operating as a short-term rental would still have to come in and apply for that license. They wouldn't have to
Throughout
get
the city,
yes, they
not
wouldn't have
just
to
in
get the
ag.
zoning change, but they would have to come in, try and say that they were a grandfathered use, and then if we deem that they're a grandfathered use, they would have to get that license on an annual basis as well, because that is a regulatory manner regulation, not the use itself.
But if we were to adopt this, it would apply throughout the entire city,
Yes,
not just in ag properties.
correct.
Okay, that was my main. Thank you.
And if I could just clarify the comments earlier with Councilman Will and Ms. Eswine. So if I understood you correct, you were talking about homeowners associations have the ability to enact restrictions.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, but not many of the neighborhoods in Alpharetta that don't have homeowners
Yes.
associations.
Yes.
Okay.
And it would be, new HOAs can, tailor their covenants according to the current business trends. You see more rental caps now than you might have, 30 or 40 years ago. And then existing HOAs would be able to potentially amend it depending on their procedures and how many people they had in favor. But then, yes, absolutely, properties that don't fall within an HOA, that don't have covenants, they wouldn't have the ability to do that.
And Mr. Woodman, I know I'm putting you on the spot, and you don't have to answer tonight if you're not prepared to, but I'm just curious if y'all have a map of what homeowners associations we have in the city of Alpharetta, in addition to, so we could kind of look to see what neighborhoods are not actually able to have a homeowners association at this point.
We don't currently have a map of all the neighborhoods and which have an active HOA or not. It's something that we could prepare, though. We could get that together for you.
We may want something at some point,
Yep.
but I was just curious if it existed right now.
Yep.
Thank you. Councilman Dorito?
Yeah, just one question. Molly, how does this impact the hotel motel excise tax the city imposes on lodging and room rentals? I mean, to me, if we're going to have regulations around short-term rentals, typically under 28 days is considered like a hotel motel, right? The excise tax would apply, the 8% excise tax, so would it not? Or would they have to start remitting that on the 20th day following the rental?
I believe that we are already receiving some hotel motel taxes. There was a law that changed not too terribly long ago, maybe 21, that required or authorized Airbnb, VRBO to actually pay directly to local jurisdictions any hotel motel taxes that were booked directly through their website. Tom would probably be able to better articulate how much we are currently getting, but under the regulatory ordinance, there is a requirement that they pay all applicable hotel and motel taxes.
And we would know who's doing that through the business license registration, right? We'd be able to track that.
I'm going to defer to Tom on how much information we get. I think that it's more limited on what properties we know are actually paying when it's coming directly from VRBO or Airbnb, but the one-off rentals, we would know for sure.
Director Harris, if you don't mind, just clear up some of that.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Molly is correct. We are receiving, the best I can tell, about $15,000 a month from Airbnbs and those type agencies, but we don't get a detailed list of that data, of where they're getting that inside our city limits.
Airbnbs, but what about just someone doing short-term rentals with a?
No individual is remitting dollars
But-
directly to us.
I would assume if the council was to approve this ordinance.
Correct. That's how we would do
We
it.
would be able to track who hasn't remitted and
There'd be an
in effect,
application
go-
process,
go
correct?
after them for the tax that they haven't remitted, right?
Correct.
Thank Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Any other questions to this point? Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
So applications, this is, again, y'all can tailor this however you want. This is just kind of what I've seen in other jurisdictions and what the version that I went off of included. So required on an annual basis. Information that has to be provided in the application includes some of the more obvious things, the property information, like where is this short-term rental, who owns it, a local contact person, which is a 24/7 contact who would be able to respond to the property. So it may not be the owner, and it could even be a third-party manager. A lot of times, if it's a person who's renting just a room in their home, it might be owner-occupied individual who is the local contact person. But it's just essentially that when we get complaints, if we wanted to reach out to the local contact person to try and intervene or, say settle down if it's a noise violation, certainly not to interject and enforce, in the place of law enforcement, but it would be a contact person to let someone know that we are getting complaints. An identification of the number of bedrooms in the property, and that would be designated coded bedrooms, not just what they're going to use or want to use as bedrooms. Occupancy calculations based on the number of bedrooms, which is, and I'll get into this, I think it's 2 per bedroom, and then it differs whether you're on septic or sewer. An acknowledgement of all of the city's applicable regulations, the short-term rental ordinance and everything that it encompasses from the applicant, and a verification of an on-site septic or the sewer system. So basically saying what is the capacity of this home? And that's intended to capture essentially, do you have enough capacity for the number of bedrooms for the occupancy load that you're proposing? Occupancy has to be memorialized by written agreement. That means that essentially an owner manager of a short-term rental would be confirming with the people who are renting from them via a written agreement, this is the number of people that's allowed on the property. This is the maximum under the ordinance, under my license from the city of Alpharetta, and you're agreeing that you're not going to have more people than that on the property. Overnight occupancy is defined as being from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. under the ordinance, and it's limited to 2 people per bedroom plus 2 additional people. If you're serviced by sewer, however, you get 2 additional people, and that's based on the capacity of septic versus having sewer lines that can accommodate maybe more. In no case, however, does the short-term rental ordinance allow for more than 15 people on a particular property. So you could have 20 bedrooms in a house, and the short-term rental ordinance would still cap you at 15 people. Now, you can change that. That's just a number that I've seen other jurisdictions find as what they wanted from a policy standpoint, but you could absolutely change that. And individuals under 2 years of age don't count towards the maximum occupancy. This goes back again to that sanitary sewer issue. Daytime occupancy is not to exceed the overnight occupancy plus 4 additional guests. So in no event would it be more than 19 people during the day. And vehicles are limited to 1 per bedroom or the capacity of the parking lot, the surface area specifically designated for vehicles, whichever is greater. So 1 per bedroom or the surface area. So if you have a larger parking lot than you do, the number of bedrooms proportionate, you could have more cars if you wanted. Rentals have to be to a responsible person, so this is a requirement on the owner or operator of a short-term rental that they have to confirm that the person they are renting to has a responsible person, that is a person who's at least 21 years of age, who's legally responsible for ensuring that they're complying with all of the city's regulations, the noise violation, parking on the property, not exceeding the number of people on it. So.
Councilman Will?
Ms. Huswine, who is going to manage the enforcement of making sure that we are putting responsible people in houses all over Atlanta?
So the owner is the one who is agreeing under our ordinance
But who
to be
enforces
doing
it?
that. Right now, I have it as code enforcement and the law enforcement officer. We're not going in and inspecting, and in fact, there's state law that says you can't go in and just inspect a rental property, period, not just short-term rental. That's not the point of this. This is so that the person who is operating it knows that they need to be making sure.
So in theory, the neighbor calls and says it's not a responsible person, and we got to send code enforcement out to do what?
They would investigate and ask. Depends on the time of day, I'm sure. I'm not aware of anybody having that complaint being made and investigated. It would certainly be something that we'd have to look into from an enforcement standpoint.
Well, and I can say that I know we have reports of people renting to too many people in the homes. Code enforcement already does that. They're not doing it for short-term rentals right now. But we have neighborhoods where they say, hey, there's 15 cars in the parking lot. I think they're renting out rooms in this house or something like that. And so typically it would be code enforcement that goes out there to determine.
Prior to permitting occupancy, the owner has to provide information about the city's ordinance to the responsible person. That makes sense. We want to make sure that if we're saying the responsible person has to comply with our ordinance, we want to make sure they're on notice. And so we're putting that affirmative duty on the owner and require written confirmation from the occupant, that responsible person, that they're aware of the regulations and are agreeing to comply. So notice has to actually be posted within every short-term rental, and this is something that when the applicant comes in, they're verifying they're going to do it. We're not going in and inspecting and saying, have you done this? We're not going to issue a license until we see that you have posted this, and we're not going to go out and check routinely, but the owner is certifying that they are going to do this. And so they'd be posting the owner's information and the local contact person, and that's for, I'd mentioned the benefit to the city is to have someone who they can communicate that there's been an issue, but it's also so that the residents have someone that they know that they're going to be able to get in touch with. If we're going to be licensing these people, we want to know that the occupants of a short-term rental have a means of communicating with a reliable person that they can communicate with. The name and address of the nearest hospital, just from a safety standpoint, you've got people from out of town, we're letting them know where that is. It provides notice of the number of occupants, whether it's overnight occupants or daytime guests, the maximum numbers of vehicles on the property, and basically a diagram or drawing of some description showing where the vehicles are authorized to be parked, trash pickup information, copy of the city's applicable noise regulations, and a copy of the short-term rental license that was issued from the city. From a life safety standpoint, this is one that I've definitely seen get a good bit of debate on from other jurisdictions, and that is life safety codes. So the way it's drafted, it's not requiring compliance with the current life safety codes. It's not requiring any kind of inspection. But what the owner is doing is certifying that the bedrooms comply with life safety that was in effect as of the date that a CO was issued for the house, meaning they haven't made any material alterations for the ingress and egress of the bedrooms that would be a life safety issue. We're not going in and checking that, but they're certifying that it is still compliant. Bedrooms, hallways, and common areas all have to have a smoke detector that meets the IRC standards. Every floor has to have a carbon monoxide detector and a fire extinguisher, and house numbers have to be visible from the street. Some other requirements, so occupation taxes have to be paid, so they would have to get a business license from the city. They have to timely pay their property taxes, and in fact, the ordinance says that a license will not be issued if you're delinquent on your property taxes. Apartments are excluded from being eligible for short-term rental, and the local contact person I had previously mentioned to you is that they provide, whether it's the owner or somebody else, a 24-hour contact person who can respond to the site within 3 hours of being contacted if needed. So the suspension and revocation of a license. So this is possible following notice and an opportunity for hearing. So essentially, if we find out that there's been some sort of a violation, as outlined here, violation of the ordinance for basically anything I've previously mentioned, or the city's noise regulations. If they provided fraudulent information in the application, we become aware of that. If they fail to meet the licensing requirements, so basically they met it and then somehow have failed to continue to meet it, they try and transfer ownership, which isn't allowed under the ordinance, or if they had it previously suspended and then continued to rent during a suspension period, all of those would trigger another violation under the ordinance and then could actually have some sort of suspension or revocation. So the first violation is a fine of $250 as well as a warning. A second violation would be a $500 fine and a license suspension between 30 and 90 days. And a third violation would be up to a $1,000 fine with revocation of the license. And then we would have a note made for the city that neither the owner or the local contact person would be eligible to reapply for a new short-term rental license for a year. So that's intended to prevent bad actors from continuing to violate the ordinance and coming in and just circumventing the fact that they had a license revoked. It also provides that every day of a violation is a separate violation. So if you have an ongoing violation, each day is technically considered a separate violation under the ordinance. So with that, happy to answer any questions, take whatever direction y'all have for moving forward.
Any other questions? Councilman Will?
It's not so much a question as an observation I'd like to make on the topic. Based on what I've heard, I would hate, so based on what I've heard, if these subdivisions have the ability to do this by a majority vote of their owners, the perception to me is that they can't get that, and therefore they're coming to the city to have an ordinance passed to circumvent the majority of the homeowners passing this new ordinance. And so we as a city are creating an entire new bureaucracy which is going to require enforcement to do something that only a few people are asking to be done. And that, in my opinion, is not our job.
So I appreciate your position. It's not just that they can't do it, it's that it's easier for a governmental entity to enforce it in a city than it is for each individual neighborhood to try to enforce that. Some of these neighborhoods are large, some are small, some of them have resources, some of them really do not. And so they're asking for something to be done in the city.
I appreciate that, but we're talking about, and again, I'm only repeating what I hear, a few people. We've had a few complaints a year. Like in one particular subdivision, they've got 3,000 houses. I may be off. But if a few people are complaining out of 3,000 or even 6,000, if there's 2 people, is that really warrant the city taking this kind of government oversight action when clearly the majority of the subdivision, if they wanted it, could vote for it? That's my challenge.
I understand, and throughout this public process, those few people will have an opportunity to reach out and let us know how they feel about it. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I think it's a little more extensive than you appreciate, but that's because I've been exposed to it for several years now, and that's why we're having a workshop to talk about it, and that's why we'll go through the same public process we do with everything. No, and I appreciate it. That's what these are for. This isn't, the fix isn't in on this. This is just, we hear concerns like this, just like we hear concerns about the tree ordinance, or we hear concerns about other things, Homeowners associations could, in theory, impose tree restrictions in their neighborhoods, but most of them don't. They have certain plans, but they don't pull together 51 or 50% plus one vote in their HOA and decide, okay, we're going to have our own neighborhood tree ordinance and things like that. So we'll just continue doing what we do and figure it out. Councilman Mitchell, and then Mayor Pro Tem.
This is something that I think is needed, is needed. Couldn't get that out. I recall across the street, someone had a party at a house that was for rent for the afternoon. It had tons of people coming. There was certainly alcohol use, there was drug use, and it depends on your perspective, but people were walking around on the outside of the house in their underwear. Now, some people would say that's a really good party, but I think most of our citizens would say, we don't want that in our neighborhood. And speaking from someone who, I don't live in an HOA where it's governed by a bunch of rules and where we can change every homeowner's. And I think there's a lot of neighborhoods in Alpharetta that would appreciate us having this on. It's a growing trend in America, and not having anything on the books at all for us to govern by is a problem for me. And I'd rather us hear from the public, hear what everyone's opinion to this is, and try and regulate it with as least force as we can, but also where we can have some skin in the game here, because I think most people really support our rental to homeowner ratio in the city, and they have for years, and they like that, they want that, and we've heard resoundingly from citizens. I've heard it for 14 years, and I think this goes right along with that we have some kind of guidelines in place so that we're not acting in retrospect. So, thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Yeah, I kind of shadow what Donald just said. There is a trend. I've got a client, I don't know what the number is now, but at one time we had over 400 rental houses, mostly down College Park. I don't know what number they're at now, but I do know it is a common practice for them to do short-term rentals in between long-terms. Just, they love it. I mean, it really fills a gap for them. If you get into a neighborhood with an HOA, I don't know the exact details in mine, but I do recall discussions when they were trying to change something. It was going to take 75% of the neighborhood to sign on. And they said it wasn't that 75% wouldn't sign on, they just can't track everybody down and get them to vote because it's within a certain time period. So I hear what you're saying, Councilman Will, but I also think we need to get ahead of it because this is corporate buying houses for rental is a big thing. It's happening now, and I think this is an opportunity for us to get ahead of it. If we wait until it is a big problem, I think we'll have more issues than we can handle trying to put it back in the bag. So I'd very much support this in whatever form we eventually legally decide on. And I mean, sure, if there's a few things in here that you think are just, don't belong, that's fine. But I think the fact that it's based on, what would you name, 4 jurisdictions at the beginning of the meeting, that similar things have, well, it doesn't matter, a good handful.
At least 4.
Okay. So it's not like we're just pioneering out here and throwing something out to see what works. This has been done. So I will favor a form of this, I can assure you.
Councilman Dorito?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm all in favor of doing some sort of, ordinance that in effect addresses this issue because Mayor Pro Tem Merkel's right. I mean, there's a huge growing trend in America of corporations outbidding individual buyers of properties to, accumulate single-family homes or townhomes or whatever to basically create a mass amount of homes in any community and rent them, and manage the rentals. And so, yeah, we do need to get ahead of that trend and make sure that we're putting some sort of enforcement around it. I am concerned, and hopefully through the process, we'll address the enforcement side of this because I hate that going through your presentation, Molly, which was great, by the way, put a lot of effort into it, and I appreciate that. One thing that rings in my mind is how are we going to enforce this? There's a lot of provisions in the ordinance. And then the other thing I want to make sure that we address and come to some sort of either compromise or reason. I'm not really into, imposing the hotel motel tax on a small homeowner in the city. If it's a corporation with so many homes they accumulate in the city and they're renting them out short term, that sort of thing. That's a different thing, and maybe we can put some definitions into how that hotel motel tax applies to these situations so that we're not hurting the individual homeowners who are already paying property taxes on those properties. So those are my 3 comments on as we go through this. As the mayor says, this is a workshop. We're just kind of throwing out ideas. And the first time I'm hearing about it as well, so I have to think through this. But it definitely has some real merit to try to come up with something to manage this in an efficient way and not create such a huge bureaucracy of the city that ultimately undermines the legislative intent of what we're trying to do. So, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Once again, I do appreciate, I know you've been working on this for a long time, and it is complex. So I appreciate the effort, and Mr. Lagerbloom, did you have anything else you wanted to add before we wrap that up?
No, when the time is right, I don't want to bore you with it tonight, but I can speak to what some of the effects are of communities that don't have a vacation rental ordinance in place and some of the downsides of not getting ahead of the regulation. Just look at VRBO or Airbnb and see the number that are already existing in Alpharetta. And the number, I think, will shock you that there's actually a good many out there. So, but I'll save that for a different point. At this point then, Mr. Mayor, we have a second item on this workshop. Do you want to go to that now? It would take us beyond our 6:30 start time of the evening meeting. We could either start it and probably start the 6:30 15 minutes late if we just rolled one right into the other, or we can postpone it and have it at the end of the evening meeting.
So
At your
preference
pleasure.
of council? All right, let's.
Keep rolling,
go ahead
it
and
is.
Proceed, just may begin the formal city council meeting a little later. So next item up under the work session items is the Parks Fund project update.
And Mr. Mayor, let me just close that loop. Molly brought up a good point. We're going to take the feedback that we got tonight. She and I will talk and see if there's any tweaks that we come back with. If you have any individual thoughts as to what you saw tonight in the presentation, just get with her directly. And this will definitely come back for another workshop before it takes any official action.
Chris, can I just throw out a suggestion, if it's possible? Is there a way, the comment you made about Airbnbs and stuff, there's a lot going on in the city. Is there a way to gather some sort of information on that for the council?
There is, and actually there's some pretty good software that exists out there that aggregates all of the different platforms that are used for vacation rental and takes them and puts them in one place. So you don't have to go to VRBO and you don't have to go to Airbnb and you don't have to go to, I'm the wrong name, Spotify or whatever, the different places you can go. I think we can put together a comprehensive list of what at least that software would tell us exists already at Alpharetta, yes.
Thank you.
Director Rogers, you have the floor.
Good evening, Mayor Council. As always, it's a pleasure to be before you tonight. We were going to bring you an update tonight of our bond projects, 8 of our bond projects, and I'll try to keep them as brief as can, realizing that time is of the essence. I think the best thing, Mr. Mayor, would be for me to talk about each of the 8 items and then ask for questions before I move on, rather than have all the questions at the end. I think that might be a little bit better to do. So if you're following along in the packet that we put, we're going to start off with the farmhouse project. The farmhouse Heritage Park has been a challenge due to access to the property. Currently, the only access that we have is from the old Milton Parkway. We have developed a draft plan based on this access, and due to topography, it'd take the funds available just to allocated in the bond to simply get access to the general area in the creek. And this access would not be ADA compliant. So staff met with the company that is currently planning to develop the property to the east of the location. They are excited and committed to providing a better access to the site for construction as well as shared parking for the site once their site is developed. Staff has met with the development company as well as the design team. We have asked the design team of that property for a proposal for the shared parking and access, and are awaiting their response. The topography of this site is much more favorable from the east than it is from the south. And in addition, staff has been working with the Georgia DOT to minimize the impact of what they're doing on the west side of the property. And we're hoping to have a meeting later this week to understand that a little bit better. So I'll be glad to answer any questions that you may have on the farmhouse project.
Any, Councilman Mitchell?
It was I remember meeting with Russell McMurray and discussing this with GDOT, and they understood that it was a site of historic importance to us, and that they would not protrude onto that. Has something changed?
Hang on just 2 seconds. No, I don't know that it has not intruded on the site to the east of the creek, but it has gotten a little bit more on our property. So we want to make sure that there is no impact there. So they're minimizing that, but we don't expect anything to the east of the property. But we wanted to keep you in mind, keep you informed that we are still talking with them because we don't know exactly what they're going to do yet.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
That?
I haven't been in there. I'm sorry, but technology is not my friend right now.
One quick question.
Councilman Dorito?
I can't pull it up.
Director Hodges, I think we have, what, $2 million for this project in the bond?
That is correct.
Okay, and that.
$2 million
$2 million is
for the-
for, what, assessing the property and designing? Is that what?
The $2 million is supposed to be for design and then access to the site where the original development was.
Will that include looking at safety, I guess, elements of how we secure that property? Because it's in such, the topography there, if you go there, it's kind of almost in a bowl.
Right.
So you have to gain access down from either that parking lot, if that company gives us access to
Right.
it, down into the property. And my concern is I want to make sure we assess the impact on people's safety who go down in that park, or even after nighttime. I don't want it to become a homeless encampment either, because it could potentially be that. So we need to design it in a way that it's either very well lit, our police can gain access to it if need be for emergencies and that sort of thing. So
Right.
that's my concern about the property itself and how costly that might be to kind of configure this park in a way that makes it safe and usable for the community.
Right, and that's certainly one of the things when we're designing the parks, we have been in contact with public safety, and public safety actually reviews the plans before we move forward, making sure that we have looked at all the aspects that we can. And so whether that means some kind of video surveillance on site or whether it means lighting, it's really too early to know that, but we do share your concern about the fact of it being a little more remote than some of our other locations and kind of out of sight, out of mind. But we will design to that, make sure that public safety has a seat at the table. So we hear that for sure. Okay. So we'll move on. Sorry, Lauren's trying to rescue me from this. I appreciate that. So we'll move from the farmhouse property to the Mid-Broadwell Park. Mid-Broadwell Park is currently under construction. You know, we started on that park when we had some development dollars about a year and a half ago, and we did as much as we could, which was put a restroom there, and then we found out that the sewer wasn't where they said the sewer was, and so we had to wait for the bond referendum. We got $500,000 to move forward on the bond referendum, and so we are moving forward on that project now. We are confident that we can get the bathroom hooked up, the playground in, the parking in, as well as some natural trails in Mid-Broadwell. And we expect that project to be done by March of 2024. That's the playground. What we're really waiting on right now is the playground. The rest of the park's going to be finished by probably end of November, and we're bringing forward the playground hopefully in November for approval, the contract for approval, and then we've got the lead time on the playground. So we're looking in March. Okay? Any questions about Mid-Broadwell? Okay. Moving forward to the next one is Old Rucker Park. Obviously on Old Rucker Road, this is a 10-acre park, now currently known as the home of the farm. The farm takes up about a little less than 2 acres, so we still have a good 8 acres that we're currently planning. We are 90% of the plans, construction plans, were submitted on August 20th of this year, and we have to do a little value engineering to get the amount of money that we have to match with what we want to do at that park. But we hope to be moving on that by the end of the year with the idea that that particular park would be built sometime and begin construction sometime in late 2024. Okay, moving on, Union Hill Park. The renovations are complete to the venue site, the covered arena at Union Hill. If you haven't had a chance to go out and see that, it turned out really well. So the concerts and the events we're hosting are doing real well. Everybody knows we're doing some concerts, but we're also going to be hosting Shamrocking for a Cure in the spring out at Union Hill. So we're really excited about that. If you keep in mind, that's an 11-acre park. It's been underutilized till now. It is now one of the trailheads. It is our northernmost trailhead for our fabulous greenway system. We have the construction drawings. We have those completed, and we are real close to putting that project out to bid. Again, we've got to do some value and engineering to make what we want to build match what we have. We're expecting that construction to begin. Well, let me keep in mind, later tonight, we're going to be looking at the design for Union Hill. So it'd be based on whether or not that design gets approved, is how quickly we can move forward with that. Any questions about Union Hill? Moving on to Waters Road Park. This 1.6 acre park, the construction began on August the 28th. So we are under construction at Waters Road Park. And we are currently thinking we're going to be done with that in spring of 2024 and have a ribbon cutting sometime in March or April of 24.
Councilman Will?
Waters Road Park, just to clarify, we have more than $780 to do this?
We have $780 left.
Left.
Right, but we did this with a design build. So we have, that means that we have a contingency of $780 is what that means. Because if the folks that designed it are the ones that are building it, so they are contracted for a specific price. So it's going to be tight, but we're confidence level is high. Moving on, Webb Bridge Park, the upper field turf. This project is the only one that we really haven't made any kind of progress on, really. Well, because we found out that the septic system that was feeding the restroom at that particular location did not work. So we've been working hard with, or Public Works has been working hard to find a different sewer connection. Y'all gave us some money to design that sewer connection. Public Works has worked to find a low pressure system that they think will probably work at Webb Bridge. They're working through all that. If that isn't the case, then by the end of the year, we should have design plans for that particular sewer location, and then be willing to be ready to move on to the replacing the turf, and we're hoping to be doing that early in 2025. That's when we think we'll replace the turf, in early 2025. Moving on to Wills Park improvements. This is what we call Wills Park proper. We are, as from the bond, we're going to be putting in the gateway entrances at both ends of Wills Park, the spine that connects the three program areas of the park. We're going to be putting in a brand new Wacky World. We're going to be putting in, we're going to be upgrading the dog park, as well as improving the disc golf course and replacing the restroom at Wacky World. We have fast-tracked Wacky World and the restroom because those are the most immediate needs on this particular project, and we are real close to doing an RFP for those projects and coming for approval on those projects to Mayor and Council. It looks like we're going to be under construction in 2024 with Wacky World and the restrooms at Wills Park. And what that really means is that Wacky World and the restrooms are going to be closed down for a period of 12 months as we're building that, because that whole unit has to be, we got stormwater issues, we got the playground issues, as well as the restrooms. So 2024, we're going to be under construction, which means we're going to have to bring in portable restrooms. We're going to have to find alternate ways around the construction to get to the ball fields, as well as beef up our other two playgrounds, because Wacky World is going to be closed for 2 years. I mean, excuse me, 1 year, not 2 years. 1 year. And we do have, we are currently working with a group that's going to be recognized a little bit later in the meeting about raising money for Wacky World as a community build program like we did 25 years ago. Okay? And then the equestrian center improvements, we are working hard to improve the equestrian center. We, as know, we have done ring number 1. That was not part of the bond referendum, but ring number 3 was the first of the bond projects that we got completed. And we are currently waiting on the design for phase 2 of the equestrian center, and that's going to be the replacement. That's going to be putting in another entryway to the equestrian center, replacing building rings number 2 and number 4, and replacing 3 barns. And then phase 3 will be the rest of the barns as well as the other connecting points of the trail, of the equestrian center. Right now, we think we have funding for phase 2, which is arenas 2, 4, 3 barns, and the entrance. If the Equestrian Foundation raises the money that they say they're going to raise.
I believe
Which
Mayor Pro
they
Tem
think- I
Merkel
think they
has a
will.
question.
Okay.
You just hit it on the head. Where is the Equestrian Foundation as far as their funds matched or their funds committed?
They have, according to the foundation, they are doing well on the fundraising. They have enough money when we get ready to do the next arena, which is arena number 2. They can match the money that's going to be needed for arena 2, and they're well on their way for the next phase. So they can fund what's next as well as what's coming because they're in their fundraising efforts right now. They are confident that they can match that they'll match that $5 million in the time frame that we're going to be working on this project. Because it's going to take us 2 or 3 years to get to the end of this, just to phase 2.
Thank you.
Councilman Will.
I appreciate that. How much have they got towards the match on the next phase? You said they've got that ready to go. How much is that?
Right. Let me see if it's in here. I think it's in here, so let me just look at my notes if you don't mind.
No, go ahead. It says they've contributed 747 so far.
Yeah. I'm not seeing it on my notes.
Director
I think
Rogers.
I want to, so I'm going to take.
I know, but we're running
Okay.
into our meeting time, so if you could just follow up and make sure to
will.
distribute that to all of council,
will.
that'd be helpful.
Okay, sorry, I'm sorry. I know they have that, but it's, I don't, if I take a guess, I'd be way off one way or the other, so I'm better off emailing that information tomorrow.
Any other questions or comments from council?
Okay.
Appreciate it. Making progress, that's all.
Okay, we are, and I will obviously always, if any council members want to ride out and look at these projects, I'm always up for a field trip. Would love to show you what's going on in the field, because it looks better on the field than it does on paper sometimes, so, thank you very much.
So, Mr. Lagerblum, I'm assuming we're going to just hold this now? There's an executive session?
Yeah, we'll just defer the executive session at the work session, and we'll just hold one after the next meeting. So it'd be appropriate to adjourn this meeting and then convene the evening meeting.
If I may, I do have to have about 5 to 10 minutes to close this meeting out and get the other meeting set with the stream and the voting systems and all of that. I have to have that.
I think council would appreciate that brief break before we start the longer meeting as well. So. All right. A motion to adjourn? Second. Motion by Mayor Pro Tem Merkel, second by Councilman Dorito. All those in favor of adjourning this meeting, please vote yes. Otherwise, vote no. It does pass unanimously. Ladies and gentlemen, we're adjourned, and we'll be reconvening for the formal city council meeting in just a few moments.